Back in the days of the enslaved people who were brought to this country and the white landowners who owned them, um, what did you call one of the enslaved people who was favored by the master, the white master, and allowed to work not in the fields but in the big house, in the master's house? That was called the house Negro, right? House Negro. Trump has a house Negro. It's Ben Carson. That he is Trump's house Negro. I have never seen a black man so tear himself down working for this racist pig. I cannot believe it. Ben Carson, of course, is the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. And Ben Carson has done not a goddamn thing in the 2+ years that he has worked for Trump, for the master, except try to buy thousands of dollars worth of furniture for his office. Ben Carson is the perfect house Negro because while he knows he's working for a racist dog, like the house Negroes back in the South before the Civil War, he's not going to give up his position because then he'll have to get out here and deal with these trashy white people. As long as Ben Carson, Trump's house Negro, is in the House, he's safe. He's got a good gig. Well, Ben Carson was in Baltimore. He went to a church in Baltimore to hold a rally to try to tell the ignorant, rat-infested people who live in Baltimore that the master was right when he's talking about how fucked up Baltimore is. So the house Negro shows up in order to convince the field hands that the massa is right. Eh? He traveled to Baltimore, as they call it in Baltimore. He traveled to Baltimore on Wednesday to defend the master's attacks on the city. The house Negro did. But his defense of the massa was cut short when the church where he was speaking, a couple of the leaders of that church came out and told him to get his black ass off the property. Ooh, shit. Really? Really. CBS Baltimore reports that Carson went to the city to talk up HUD's work in Baltimore and to reassure the field hands that the president wants to work with them to help improve their city. Amen. The house Negro had wanted to speak on property that belonged to the Morning Star Baptist Church in Baltimore, but the church told him, no, fuck no. You're not going to come out here, house Negro, and speak for the master. Get off our property. Ow! Really? Really? Carson left. He gave his speech at another location, but he couldn't help bad-mouthing the church for kicking his black ass off the property. Carson complained, quote, "It's a church. They say, get off our property. I mean a church. Well, we're talking about helping people. This is just the level to which we have sunk." End quote. The house Negro. Gregory Evans, a member of the Morning Star Church, told CBS Baltimore that the house Negro never told the church beforehand that he, the house Negro, was going to use church property as a backdrop for his bullshit to defend the white massa in the White House, in the big house over there in D.C. So Gregory Evans was one of the people who said to the house Negro, get your ass out of here, boy. This is Trump's America, folks. Now, speaking of rat-infested apartments and houses in Baltimore that Trump has made a big deal about. Well, surprise, surprise, surprise. New York Magazine is reporting, well, let me just read a little bit what they wrote. When Donald Trump tweeted last weekend that Baltimore is a, quote, disgusting rat and rodent-infested mess, end quote, many prominent residents and natives of that city were incensed. Mayor Bernard Young, a Democrat, said Trump's comments were, quote, completely unacceptable, and Maryland Governor Larry Hogan, a Republican, called them, quote, outrageous and inappropriate, end quote. But for some Baltimore residents, especially those who live in properties owned by Jared Kushner, the white masse's son-in-law, the comments had a ring of truth, the comments that Trump had made. Kushner's family business, the New York-based Kushner Companies, owns thousands of apartments in and around Baltimore. And according to the Associated Press, they're a mess. Quote, some have been criticized for the same kind of disrepair and neglect that the president has accused local leaders of failing to address. Residents have complained about mold, bed bugs, leaks, mice, plenty of mice, and they say management appears to in no hurry to fix the problems. In other words, fuck you. I'm a nice Jewish boy from New York, and I am married to the president's daughter. I am married to the master's daughter. And I'm not going to do shit for you black and brown people. Desmond James, who lives in the Kushner-owned Commons at White Marsh. God damn, that sounds like a good... Doesn't that sound like a place you want to live? The Commons at White Marsh. Woo-hoo. Mr. James told the Associated Press that Trump's criticism of Baltimore is clearly more about picking a fight with Elijah Cummings than the problems themselves. Mr. James said, quote, his son-in-law owns all this, and he can fix it. I'm pretty sure he has a lot of money. That's kind of weird that you want to talk trash. If you want to make improvements, you can make improvements, end quote. This is property owned by the Jew, Jared Kushner, who is married to the Christian's daughter, the Christian being the master in the big house, Donald Trump. Yeah, I know what I'm doing tonight. If it's freaking you out too fucking bad, deal with it. The experience of the people interviewed by the Associated Press aligned with previous reportings on the awful conditions in Kushner's properties. A 2017, 2 years ago, investigation by the New York Times and ProPublica titled The Beleaguered Tenants of Kushnerville, the Jew who owns all this shit in Baltimore, the rat-infested apartments that his Christian father-in-law talks about, the Jew Jared Kushner. Kushnerville. The article covered the issue in painstaking detail from the, quote, mold and mildew beneath the carpet to the raw sewage flowing from tenants' sinks. Now, whose responsibility is it to keep the apartments in good repair? In this case, Jared Kushner, the Jew, who works for the Christian, who runs the plantation. Kushner Companies, known in the area, Baltimore, for its aggressive debt collection tactics, generates $90 million in revenue a year in Baltimore, according to the Baltimore Sun. And the company has shown no interest in keeping the rats out. Shannon Darrow, a local fair housing activist, tells the Washington Post, quote, basically, Kushner has been creating a race to the bottom in terms of poorly maintained properties. He's been very, very deeply implicated. So, hey, Christian master of the house. You sent your house Negro down to browbeat the field hands living in this shit. But what about your Jew son-in-law? What about him? He's the one that owns the fucking property. Mr. White Christian man, master of the house. Why don't you talk to your Jewish son-in-law and tell him to pick up a fucking broom or some rat eradicator or some roach powder? You miserable fuckers, every one of you. Hi, Truth Seekers. Mike Malloy here. As you know, we've switched formats and are now broadcast exclusively on the Progressive Voices Network. So that means you get fewer program interruptions, no corporate commercials, and lots of profanity. But our format change also means some of our radio listeners no longer hear the program. It's been a while since I mentioned our podcasts, so you may have forgotten that there is a way to listen to this program anytime you need a good dose of screaming. Visit MikeMalloy.com and subscribe to our podcasts. You have your choice. You can listen to the ranting with the audio podcast or listen and watch me lose control with a video podcast subscription. As a podcast subscriber, you can download the program to your mobile device and take me with you wherever you go. And if you have a friend who needs a dose of truth-seeking, you can give a gift subscription as well. That's MikeMalloy.com, and never miss a minute of the uncensored fun and frivolity.